During the Indonesian occupation, there were only two internationally connected organisations that were able to stay in East Timor. One was the Red Cross, and by the nature of their work, they don't take a public issue on political questions. They offer assistance, but they can't and they don't speak out on the political solutions or possibilities for different countries in which they work. There was the Catholic Church as well, and that was able to work more on the international scene because of the connections of the Church around the world. It's the Catholic Church in East Timor, but it's the Catholic Church of the whole world. So the bishops could be connected with their fellow bishops and other parts of the Church around the world. Bishop Bello was the bishop who spent most time under the Indonesian occupation. His predecessor had spoken out against the Indonesian occupation, or at least the human rights abuses that were happening. But when he stepped down, the Indonesian government put a lot of pressure on the Vatican and the Church to appoint a successor who wouldn't be so outspoken. Bishop Bello, when he was appointed, was a very young bishop, but he gradually took on the role of being a spokesperson for the people of East Timor, their human rights and their situation. The bishop's house also was located right on the seafront, the centre of town in Dili, which wasn't a big city at that time, but it was very close to the Red Cross building and also very close to the main tourist hotel where many people stayed. So because of Bishop Bello's influence and the influence of the Church, many people came to consult him and seek his advice about what was happening, his counsel, his knowledge about what was happening in the territory. At the beginning of the Indonesian occupation, the majority of people in East Timor were not Catholic. They had been influenced by the Catholic Church, they had been educated often by the Catholic Church, but they weren't formally Catholic. As Bishop Bello and the other priests in the area began to take a more public stand to defend the people, more people became Catholic, and they saw the Church as a way of defending themselves and also allowing them to express their own identity and language. The main language of East Timor is Tetum. That couldn't be used publicly. Only the Indonesian language was the language of government, was the language of education. But when people came to church or involved in church events and celebrations, they could use their own language. So that was an important way of expressing their identity in a very difficult and oppressive situation. Bishop Bello spoke out on their behalf, and by his actions helped the people to maintain their identity, be protected, and under that aegis to seek self-determination. Because the Church in East Timor was effectively the only institution where people could express themselves, use their own language and gather to talk about their situation, it became a very important place. Bishop Bello's role in that as the main spokesman for the Church, the main representative of the Church, was to help connect the people in East Timor with the outside world. So it was through him that information could be communicated about what was happening in East Timor, and also it was through him and his work that he was able to demand a referendum for East Timor so that the people of East Timor could have a say in their future. East Timor had been a colony of Portugal. When a colonising power leaves a territory or is thinking about the future of a territory, under the UN system, the people are meant to have a say in what they want their future to be. That had never been given to the people of East Timor. So Bishop Bello used that proposition in the UN Charter and used his experience of the situation to demand that a referendum be held so that the people of East Timor could seek and decide their future. 2 years later, in 1991, a panel was due to come to East Timor to investigate the situation. At that time, a large demonstration was held by the people of East Timor. The demonstration was violently repressed by the Indonesian authorities. That repression is known as the Dili Massacre. Bishop Bello was able to assist two witnesses to that massacre to be smuggled out of the country to give their testimony to the UN. It was an important moment because that massacre was filmed. It was an important moment for the outside world to get some concrete evidence about what was happening in East Timor. The witness of Bishop Bello, the information that he gathered, was passed on to the Pope in the Vatican in Rome. When Pope John Paul II was due to visit Indonesia, he took a very significant stand to show that East Timor's future had not been decided formally and legally. When he came to Indonesia, he visited the capital of Indonesia, but he also made a separate and direct visit to East Timor. He came and landed at the airport in Dili and held a mass for 100 to 200,000 people, a huge crowd for a country, an area which only had about 500,000 people living in it. People gathered from all around the territory. They walked for days despite military roadblocks to prevent them getting there. So it was a dangerous thing to get there. They came in great numbers, and his presence signified that the future of East Timor had not been formally and justly decided. The Pope's visits to any country are always pastoral, but they also have a political dimension. When the Pope went to a country, when John Paul went to a country, he would usually come down from the plane and immediately kiss the ground at the foot of the steps from the plane. When he came to East Timor, to signify that the future of the land hadn't been decided, whether it was going to be East Timorese or whether the East Timorese people would choose to stay with Indonesia, that hadn't been decided. So when he came down the steps from the plane and he celebrated Mass very near the airport, before Mass he kissed a cross which signified that the sufferings of Christ, he was identifying the sufferings of people with the sufferings of Christ, and he was here to be with them in their difficult situation and in their sufferings. The second thing he did at that huge Mass was to celebrate the Mass not in the language that had been agreed, which was to have been Latin, nor did he celebrate the Mass in Indonesian, which was the language of the occupation. He celebrated Mass in Tetum, the language of the people. And this was a great support for the people who had walked for days and many hours to get there. They felt that their identity and their culture was being recognised and valued. Because of his opposition to the Indonesian occupation, Bishop Bello was put under immense pressure by the Indonesian authorities. He was under surveillance at all times. There were 2 attempts on his life, but he continued to speak out and to speak up for the East Timorese people. And because of his work in supporting them and being a voice for their situation, the church in Indonesia grew from 25% of the population in 1975 to 90% of the population in 1999 when the independence referendum was held. The Catholic Church became a wonderful place for people to express their nationality and their identity over the years of occupation. They could use their own language, they could go in processions through the streets singing in their own language, which they couldn't ordinarily do in public. So the Catholic Church was a defender of their human rights, of their cultural identity, and their desire for self-determination and ultimately for independence. Bishop Bello was a very important voice for that, but the Church as a whole had a huge role in enabling people and giving people the freedom to seek their self-determination, their future.